The smell inside a tank was a world of its own: hot metal, engine oil, cordite, and sweat. It clung to everything. Even when the men crawled out to stretch their legs, they carried that scent like a badge. Sergeant Thomas "Tommy" Hale had long stopped noticing it. What he did notice, however, was the smell missing the faint comfort of T. It was June 1944, just outside Villers-Bocage, France. The Normandy countryside was torn apart by the thunder of British and German armor. Tommy's unit, part of the 22nd Armored Brigade, had been rolling since dawn. The sun was high now, beating down on the thick steel of their Cromwell tank, turning it into a slow-cooking oven. Inside, the crew were exhausted. Any chance of a brew? Sarge, Corporal Evans, the gunner, muttered through his dry throat. His voice echoed against the hull. Brew. Tommy glanced at the small metal tin by his foot, dented soot black from 100 fires. Only if you fancy being roasted alive by Jerry while you wait for the kettle. Evans grinned weakly. Wouldn't be the worst way to go. They all laughed, but not for long. The British were famous, or infamous, for their obsession with tea, and even here, amid war, it was a ritual that refused to die. Every time the tanks stopped, the men would climb out, pull out a Benghazi burner, a makeshift stove built from sand-filled tins and petrol, and brew a pot. It was their only moment of normalcy. A cup of tea meant life, meant routine, meant that the world beyond this madness still existed. That morning, though, they were running late. The radio crackled with reports of German armor nearby, but after hours of crawling through the bocage, the temptation was too strong. The order came over the intercom: hold position, and just like that, across the hedgerows and dusty fields, dozens of British tankers began their favorite ritual: tea break. Evans climbed out first, his boots hitting the dirt. Bloody perfect spot, he said, setting up his burner under the shade of a broken apple tree. Bit of quiet for once. Tommy followed, scanning the tree line. Quiet doesn't last long in Normandy. He was right. At 9 a.m., the sound came, a deep growl, heavy and distant. German Tiger tank engines. Then, chaos. Before anyone could react, shells tore through the fields. One struck the tank beside them, a Firefly, bursting into flame, its turret thrown aside like a toy. Evans dropped his tin, scalding water spilling into the dirt. Back inside, back inside, Tommy shouted, shoving his men toward the Cromwell. They scrambled in, slamming the hatches, but it was too late for many. The Tiger, commanded by Michael Whitman, had caught the brigade completely off guard. Within 15 minutes, 14 British tanks were burning wrecks. The T-tins still sat beside some of them, untouched. Inside their tank, Tommy's crew fired blindly, the gun recoiling against Evans's shoulder. They managed one, maybe two shots before a shell smashed through the hedge near them, shaking the tank so hard Tommy thought the world had ended. Then silence, broken only by the sound of fire crackling outside. They survived that day, barely. Many didn't. When the order finally came to retreat, Tommy climbed out of the hatch and saw the fields littered with burnt metal and smoke. Among the wrecks, blackened teapots lay scattered, twisted by the heat. Evans stared at one, then kicked it away. Bloody tea, he muttered. Nearly killed us. Tommy said nothing. He looked at the teapot again, dented, harmless, ordinary, and wondered if it really was the tea's fault, or if the war had just found another cruel way to make everything sacred feel foolish. That night, huddled in a foxhole beside the tank, he lit a small fire and boiled what little water they had left. When he handed Evans a tin mug, the man looked at him with disbelief. "You're serious?" Tommy nodded. "Aye. Still alive, aren't we? Might as well drink to it." They sipped in silence, the taste bitter but familiar. The world outside burned, but inside that moment, inside that cup, was something like peace. None of them knew it yet, but this simple act, brewing tea under fire, would soon change the very design of every British tank that came after. The next few weeks after Villers-Bocage were nothing but fire, fear, and fatigue. The 22nd Armored Brigade limped through Normandy like a wounded animal, tank numbers thinning, men hollowed by what they'd seen. But somehow, the habit survived the ritual of the brew. Sergeant Tommy Hale still carried the same dented tea tin from that cursed morning. It rattled quietly in the corner of the Cromwell tank whenever they rolled over the rough French roads. Evans joked that it was the lucky charm keeping them alive, but Tommy wasn't sure he believed in luck anymore. Every time the column stopped, he'd glance at his watch, then at the horizon. The pattern was the same. The engines would die down, hatches would creak open, and the smell of petrol burners would fill the air. It was strange they'd been ambushed because of a tea break, yet no one could stop doing it. He understood why. The war stripped away everything that made men human: food, sleep, comfort, until all that was left was instinct. A cup of tea wasn't just drink. It was a reminder that they were still people, not parts of a machine. But the price of that reminder was getting too high. One morning near Cannes, the brigade halted along a hedge. Smoke still hung in the air from the previous night's bombardment. "All right, lads," Tommy said. "Make it quick." 10 minutes. Evans and Private Miller, the driver, climbed out with their burners. The hiss of boiling water mixed with birdsong. For a moment, there was quiet to quiet. Tommy's gut twisted. He climbed halfway out of the turret and scanned the tree line with his binoculars. Nothing then. Out of the corner of his eye, movement, a flash of gray metal. Inside now, he shouted, but the shell landed before the words finished leaving his mouth. The ground erupted. Miller went down instantly, his burner flipping into the dirt. The Cromwell rocked from the shockwave, earth raining onto its armor. Tommy hauled Evans back inside and slammed the hatch. Jesus Christ, Evans panted, his face streaked with mud and blood. Sniper shell, probably an 88, Tommy said. His voice was flat. They're watching the roads now. Every time we stop, they're watching. That night, after the medics carried what was left of Miller away, Tommy sat alone by the tank, staring at the cold teapot. He didn't even have the strength to curse it anymore. Word spread fast across the regiments. Commanders started warning their crews, no more brew-ups outside the armor, but it wasn't a rule anyone could truly enforce. You couldn't tell a man not to crave warmth after spending days inside a steel coffin. By autumn, the army began recording something unexpected, a disturbing percentage of their tank. Casualties weren't dying inside the tanks at all. They were being killed beside them, shot, shelled, or burned while trying to make tea. Reports from field hospitals painted the same picture again and again. Burns from spilled fuel tins, shrapnel wounds from ambushes during halts, men found with blackened mugs still clutched in their hands. For the officers back in England, it was a grim realization tea was killing as many as the enemy guns, but none of them dared suggest banning it. They knew what morale meant out there, so the engineers started thinking. Somewhere in a design office in Lulworth and later Chertsey, a question took root. What if they didn't have to get out of the tank at all? At first, it sounded ridiculous. You could barely move inside a Cromwell. The idea of boiling water in there seemed like madness. The fumes, the risk of fire, the lack of space. But someone pointed out that the tanks already ran electrical systems, and waste heat was everywhere. If that heat could be used, just a few degrees of it, you could make a small sealed heater, enough to boil a pint of water, enough for tea. The suggestion made its way through reports, memos, and meetings, but out in France, Tommy and his surviving crew were still crawling through fields that reeked of diesel and death. They didn't know that. Far away, engineers were trying to solve their small, human problem. One night, when the rain hammered down so hard it drowned out the distant artillery, Evans passed Tommy a mug of rainwater mixed with cold tea leaves. "No fire this time," he said quietly. Tommy took a sip and winced. It was disgusting, but it was tea, and that was enough. In that bitter cold taste was a question that would outlive the war itself, a question about survival and comfort, and the strange things men would risk just to feel human again. And somewhere, the first blueprint lines of a device were being drawn, one that would soon make it possible to have both safety and tea inside a tank. Asterisk, asterisk. By early 1945, the war in Europe was dragging toward its brutal end. Germany was falling back, but every mile was paid for with blood. The British armored divisions pushed east through Belgium, then the Rhine, steel beasts grinding through ruined towns that smelled of smoke and fear. Inside one of those beasts sat Sergeant Tommy Hale, now commander of a newer Comet tank. He'd lost 2 of his original crews since Normandy. Miller was gone, and Evans, well. Evans had been transferred to hospital after a blast near Eindhoven left him, half deaf and half mad from shock. The tank still rattled with the same old tea tin. Tommy kept it wedged behind his seat, dented and black with soot. He couldn't bring himself to throw it away. It was useless now. They hadn't brewed properly in months, but it was a reminder of the men who'd shared it, and of the mornings when war paused just long enough for a sip. Every few days, though, he'd still see it. Another crew pulled from a smoking wreck, the bodies laid out beside burned fuel cans and melted mugs. Always the same story. They'd stopped for tea. The officers started calling it the brew death. Grim humor for a grim truth. Far away in Britain, in a drafty workshop at the Fighting Vehicles Research and Development Establishment in Chertsey, a man named Engineer Harold Wilkins was sketching lines on a sheet of paper. He wasn't a soldier. He'd never seen the inside of a tank, but he'd read the casualty reports, and he understood electricity. He'd spent weeks poring over field logs that mentioned crew fatalities while dismounted, most during non-combat breaks. He muttered to himself as he drew, "If they can't stop leaving the tank, we'll make the tank do the job." The device he imagined was simple in theory, a small, sealed water heating vessel, powered by the tank's own electrical system. It could boil enough water for tea, soup, or a rationed meal without a flame, without a fire, without the men stepping outside. He called it the vessel boiling electric, though the mechanics soon just called it the BV. No one in command took it seriously at first. A teapot for tanks, one general scoffed. "We're fighting a war, not opening a cafe." But Wilkins was stubborn. He sent prototypes to the proving grounds, tested them in the turrets of Centaur and Churchill tanks, and proved the water reached boiling point without endangering the crew. The results spoke louder than jokes. Meanwhile, back across the channel, Tommy's war rolled toward its close. The Rhine crossing was chaos, bridges bombed, towns in ruins, snipers everywhere. One afternoon, while waiting for an engineer convoy to rebuild a road, Tommy's tank sat idle beside a crater. He and Corporal Jennings, his new gunner, sat in silence. The men didn't talk much anymore. The war had squeezed the words out of them. Jennings broke the silence first. "Do you ever think what you'll do after, Sarge?" Tommy shrugged. "If there's an after, I might open a garage. Fix cars. Maybe. Something that doesn't explode." Jennings grinned. "And Tommy gave a faint smile. Always he reached for his battered tin, more out of habit than hope. The war had taken nearly everything, but not that. He poured a bit of cold water from his canteen, swirled the dregs of old leaves around, and pretended it was enough. When the wind blew across the crater, it carried the faint smell of something burning far away. Not gunpowder, not diesel, just smoke. He thought of Villiers, he thought of Evans Miller and all those who'd gone for a brew and never come back. That night, while the men slept in their steel beds, Tommy scribbled in his notebook a habit he'd picked up since Normandy. A single sentence sat under the date: "We keep dying for a drink of tea." Someone should fix that. He didn't know it then, but that note would one day end up in a regimental report, one that Wilkins's team at Chertsey would read while developing their prototypes back in England. The first working BV was installed in a Centurion, tanked by late 1945. It was ugly, a metal box bolted to the turret wall with a spout and a safety valve. But when it hissed to life and the engineers poured steaming water into tin mugs, they all fell silent. Wilkins smiled faintly. There, no one dies for tea again. He had no idea how right he was. By the time Tommy's regiment crossed into Germany, the war was almost done. Yet the men still brewed when they could, even if it meant risking a shell. For all the danger, tea meant home, and for most of them, home was all that was left worth fighting for. In the end, it wasn't the biggest gun or the thickest armor that changed the lives of British tankers. It was something small, something human, the ability to stay inside the steel and still have a moment of peace. And though Tommy didn't know it, the next generation of tankers would inherit that gift, a hot brew under armor, born from the blood and lessons of men like him. The guns fell silent in May 1945. For the first time in 6 years, the world exhaled. The battlefields of Europe, once alive with thunder and smoke, now lay quiet graveyards of twisted steel and shattered helmets. The war was over, but for the men who survived it, the silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like waiting for something that never came. Sergeant Tommy Hale stood beside his tank for the last time on a grey morning in Hamburg. The Cromwell's paint was scarred, its treads caked with mud that had dried into the shape of the war itself. He ran his hand along the armor, not lovingly, but with a kind of tired respect. The machine had kept him alive when so many others hadn't. "Orders are in," said Corporal Jennings, coming up beside him. "They're sending us home next week." Tommy nodded, staring at the horizon. Home. The word felt strange in his mouth, like something he'd forgotten how to say. He looked down at the dented tea tin still wedged into his kit bag. Against all odds, it had survived every shell, every fire, every desperate retreat. It was absurd, really. Men had died beside him, and yet that tin lived on. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. That night, in the ruins of a German farmhouse, he filled the tin one last time with water from his canteen. No fire, no burner, just cold water and the faint taste of iron. He passed it around to the crew. They drank quietly, each sip a small act of farewell. "For Miller," Jennings murmured. "For Evans," Tommy added. "For all the bloody brews we never finished," someone said, and the rest nodded. When Tommy returned to England, the air felt too soft, the streets too clean. Civilians bustled through London as if the war had never happened, as if men hadn't burned for their tea on the other side of the channel. He tried the garage life like he'd said he would. Fixing engines came easy. They didn't scream or bleed when something broke, but the nights were harder. Sometimes he woke to the echo of tank shells, or to the phantom smell of diesel and boiling water. One afternoon, he was adjusting a carburetor when a man in a khaki overcoat walked into the workshop. "Sergeant Hale." Tommy turned, wiping his hands. "Used to be." "Who's asking?" The man smiled. "Harold Wilkins, Ministry of Supply. You don't know me, but I know you, or rather, your report from Normandy." Tommy frowned. "My report?" Wilkins nodded. "You wrote something after Villers-Bocage about crews dying for a cup of tea. That line made its way through the chain. It's part of why we started designing this." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a small metal box, roughly the size of a helmet, gleaming under the workshop light. On its side was a small spout and an electrical plug. Tommy raised an eyebrow. "Looks like a kettle, in a sense." "It is," Wilkins said with a grin. "We call it the boiling vessel. It fits inside a tank, runs off the electrical system, boils water safely. No flames, no smoke. The lads can make tea without stepping out." Tommy stared at it for a long moment. He reached out, ran his fingers over the smooth metal. "So that's it," he said quietly. "We lose half the boys for a bloody cuppa, and now someone finally makes one that won't get them killed." Wilkins didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look on Tommy's face said everything. They tested the first production models later that year in new Centurion tanks. Tommy was invited to one of the trials at Bovington Camp. When he climbed inside, the smell hit him: hot oil, gun grease, rubber, but underneath it all, something new, the faint aroma of tea. A young corporal handed him a steaming mug. "It's from the BV, sir. Works like a dream." Tommy took the mug, felt the heat through the metal. He lifted it slowly to his lips and drank. It tasted exactly the same as it had in Normandy. Strong, bitter, a little too sweet, but this time, no shells fell, no engines screamed, no men died for it. For a moment, his eyes stung, and not from the steam. He looked at Wilkins standing by the hatch, watching. "You've done a good thing, mate," Tommy said softly. "A damn good thing." Wilkins smiled. "No, you did, you and every man who carried a tin like that." Tommy looked down at his old dented tea tin sitting on the floor beside his boot. He picked it up, placed it next to the gleaming BV, and laughed quietly. From this too, that hell of an upgrade. That night, when the test was over and the base went quiet, Tommy sat on the tank's hull under the stars. The war was done, but its ghost would never really leave him. Still, in that cup of hot tea, brewed safely under armor, there was something close to peace. He finally understood that the small things, warmth, comfort, a moment to breathe, could be what saved a man's life as surely as armor or ammunition. And somewhere deep in the base, another engineer was already sketching improvements on the BV, because for British tankers, tea wasn't just tradition anymore, it was survival. Asterisk, asterisk. By 1948, the world had changed. The bombs were gone, but the shadows of war lingered in every silence, every cautious smile, every stretch of empty land across Europe. Britain was rebuilding, its soldiers turning back into fathers, clerks, mechanics, anything but fighters. Yet the army rolled on because peace never lasts long enough to forget the need for steel. Sergeant Tommy Hale, now a civilian instructor at Bovington Camp, spent his days teaching young recruits how to survive inside the same kind of machines that had once nearly killed him. He wasn't much for lectures, but the rookies respected him, the quiet man with the Normandy ribbon and a stare that could cut through armor. The first time he showed them the new Centurion tank, they whistled. It was bigger, heavier, meaner than the Cromwell, and it had something none of them expected. "What's that thing, Sarge?" one lad asked, pointing to the small metal box bolted near the turret wall. Tommy grinned. "That, son, is a boiling vessel. The BV best bit of kit the army ever made." The lads laughed, thinking it was a joke. But when Tommy plugged it in and steam began to hiss softly from the spout, the smell of hot tea filled the confined air. For a moment, the laughter died. Even the young ones who'd never fought, never known the fear of being caught outside a tank, understood that this wasn't just a kettle, it was history. Tommy poured each of them a mug. "When I was your age," he said, "we had to climb out, light a burner, and hope Jerry didn't fancy target practice. Half the lads who died in France weren't killed fighting. They were killed for this, for a bloody cup of tea." The recruits sipped quietly. The lesson sank deeper than any lecture could. Later that day, in the mess hall, Tommy met Harold Wilkins again, older now, balding, his glasses fogged from the cold Dorset air. "Still working miracles?" Tommy asked. Wilkins chuckled. "Just improvements. We're making the BV standard issue across the whole armored division now. Not just Centurions, the Comets, the Churchill, Crocodiles, even the new FV series. Every one of them will have one." Tommy raised an eyebrow. "Every tank in the army?" Wilkins nodded. We've had reports from the lads in Palestine and Korea. They swear it's keeping them alive. Not because of the tea itself, mind you, but because it keeps them inside the armor when the shooting starts." Tommy smiled. "And here I thought it was just to keep us civilized." Wilkins leaned closer. "You know, I still keep your report pinned above my desk. The one with that line about dying for a drink of tea. Reminds me why we built the damn thing." Tommy looked away, embarrassed. "Didn't think anyone read that." "Oh, they did," Wilkins said softly, "and it changed things." In the following months, Tommy saw it for himself. The recruits trained with discipline, their tanks now fitted with that small, gleaming BV on every side. It hissed quietly during long exercises, offering steam warmth and comfort amid the grinding roar of engines. One cold winter morning, a blizzard swept across the camp. Visibility dropped to nothing, the tanks crawling forward like ghosts through the snow. Inside, the recruits were shivering, their breath misting in the air. Then Tommy saw one of them reach for the BV switch. A few minutes later, the scent of boiling water spread through the steel hull. "Never thought a kettle could keep us going," one of them murmured. Tommy smiled. "It's not the kettle, lad. It's what it means." They poured their tea, passing mugs between gloved hands, their laughter echoing faintly through the intercom. The tank rolled on, warm and alive inside, while the storm howled outside just as German fire once had. That night, when the day's drills were done, Tommy stood by the tanks in the motor yard. The air was still, the stars sharp above the frozen ground. He placed his hand on the cold metal hull and whispered, almost to himself, "We used to climb out and die for a drink of tea. Now we can live for it." Behind him, the sound of laughter drifted from the barracks. Young soldiers, boys, really drinking, singing, arguing over cards. For the first time in years, Tommy felt something like hope. Maybe all the pain, all the loss, had built towards something after all. He looked down at the dented tea tin he still carried, the one from village. It was scratched, almost rusted through, but he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. He placed it on the ground beside a Centurion's track, where the BV's soft hum could be heard inside. Replaced but not forgotten, he muttered, and smiled. The wind carried the smell of diesel and steam, and for a heartbeat, he could almost see Evans and Miller again sitting in the Normandy sun, cups in hand, alive and laughing. Asterisk, asterisk,